Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive with us. Today we're tackling something that I think is going to resonate with a lot of you.
Oh, yeah.
It's something that can really trip us up in our financial lives.
Definitely.
We're talking about financial overconfidence. And to really get into it,
Yeah.
we've got a whole stack of research papers here that we're going to break down.
Okay.
So we'll be looking at how overconfidence is defined,
Right.
how it shows up in the real world, and some of the factors that contribute to it.
Interesting.
And let me tell you, some of the findings are pretty surprising.
Oh, I bet. It's one of those things, though, isn't it?
It is.
That we all kind of think like, oh, yeah, I'm good with money.
Right.
But then when you actually look at the research,
Totally.
it paints a slightly different picture.
Totally different picture.
Yeah, and it has big implications for, like, our actual decisions.
Huge.
Yeah.
So let's just start with the basics here.
Okay.
What exactly is financial overconfidence?
So it's not just about being optimistic or, feeling good about your finances. It's about actually overestimating your financial knowledge and abilities.
Okay.
So it's like the gap between how good you think you are with money and how good you actually are. And that gap can have some pretty serious consequences.
So it's a measurable bias.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not just a feeling.
Yeah.
We've got this fascinating systematic review here.
Okay.
Published in Cogent Economics and Finance. And they looked at, get this, 132 studies
Wow.
on this topic
Okay.
between 2001 and August of this year.
A lot of research.
So we're talking decades of research
Yeah.
on overconfidence.
That's a lot of data.
What were some of the key things that they found
Okay.
about what causes financial overconfidence in the first place?
So they found a bunch of different factors,
So-
from demographics,
Okay.
like age and gender,
Okay.
to personality traits,
Interesting.
to past experiences in the market. One interesting finding was that men tend to have higher levels of financial overconfidence than women.
Now, why would that be?
That is a great question.
Yeah,
And researchers are still exploring all the reasons behind that.
right.
It could be, tied to cultural expectations around men and risk-taking, or maybe differences in how financial literacy is approached
Yeah,
in different social groups.
interesting.
But more research is definitely needed to unpack that fully.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how early on
Yeah,
those expectations are shaped
totally.
and how they might play out in our financial lives.
For sure.
So we know some of the causes,
Right.
but what about the consequences?
Okay.
Does all this confidence actually translate into better financial outcomes?
Well, sadly, the research shows that it doesn't.
Okay.
In fact, it often leads to the opposite.
Really?
One consistent finding is that overconfidence leads to more frequent trading.
Okay, so you're feeling confident.
Yeah.
You're making moves in the market.
You're buying and selling.
Yeah. What's the downside there?
Well, every time you trade, you're incurring transaction costs.
Oh, right.
So even if you make some good calls, those fees can really eat into your returns.
Right.
So overconfident investors,
Yeah.
they often end up doing more harm than good,
Interesting.
simply because they're trading too much.
So it's almost like they're their own worst enemy.
Exactly.
Like sometimes the best thing you could do is just
Nothing.
nothing,
Especially in investing.
especially in investing.
Yeah.
This systematic review also found a link between overconfidence and surprisingly lower expected returns.
Yeah.
Why would that be? I mean, you think confidence would lead to better results, right?
You would think so.
Yeah.
But overconfidence can lead to more impulsive decisions, like chasing hot stocks or trying to time the market.
Right.
And those strategies often backfire.
Uh-huh.
Overconfident investors, they may end up buying high and selling low,
Oh.
which is kind of a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
They're essentially playing this high-stakes game of chance.
It's almost like they think they can outsmart the market,
Yeah.
which rarely ends well.
Right.
Speaking of real-world examples,
Yes.
there was a study on first-time homebuyers that really caught my eye
Oh, yeah.
in this review.
That one's fascinating.
What did they find there?
So they found that overconfident individuals were more likely to take on larger mortgages
Okay.
than they could comfortably handle.
They were overestimating?
They were overly optimistic about their future income
Oh.
and their ability to manage their expenses.
So they're biting off more than they can chew financially.
Exactly.
Wow.
And here's the kicker.
Okay.
These overconfident individuals were also less likely to seek financial advice.
Oh, wow.
It's like they were so sure of themselves,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't see the need to get a second opinion or
That's
do their due diligence.
a really good point about overconfidence,
Yeah.
leading to these financial blind spots
Yeah.
and buying a house.
Huge decision.
It's a huge decision.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see the impact of overconfidence, not just in investments,
Yeah.
but on these major life decisions as well.
Absolutely.
Now, it's not just about internal calculations.
Right.
The way information is presented to us
Yes.
can also play a role in our choices,
For sure.
even if the underlying facts are the same.
Yeah.
And this brings us to another interesting study,
Okay.
which explores something called the framing effect.
The framing effect.
Can you break that down for us?
Yeah. So imagine you're offered two investment options.
Okay.
Option A guarantees you'll earn a 5% return.
All right.
Option B gives you a 50% chance of earning a 10% return
Okay.
and a 50% chance of losing everything.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Which would you choose?
I think I'd go with the guaranteed 5%.
Yeah, that's a common choice.
Okay.
And it actually illustrates the framing effect perfectly.
Okay.
Both options have the same expected value,
Okay.
but option A is framed in terms of gains, making it seem more appealing.
Got it.
Now, what if I told you option C guarantees you'll lose 95% of your investment,
Okay.
while option D gives you a 50% chance of keeping your entire investment
Right.
and a 50% chance of losing everything?
Now I'm leaning towards option D, even though it's riskier.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Just changing the way the options are framed
Yeah.
can drastically influence our choices,
Wow.
even when the underlying facts remain the same.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is.
So it's not just about being overconfident in our own abilities,
Right.
but also about being aware of how information is presented
Yeah,
to us.
exactly.
And to make things even more complex, our emotions can actually amplify this framing effect,
They do.
especially when we're feeling stressed or anxious.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So you're saying that even negative emotions
Yeah.
can sometimes push us
Yeah,
towards riskier choices.
they can.
Tell me more about that.
Okay, so this study published in Neuro Report found that negative emotions can make us more sensitive to potential losses.
Interesting.
So when faced with a choice that's framed positively,
Yeah.
we might cling to that seemingly safe option,
Okay.
even if it's not statistically the best choice.
Oh, so our emotions are like hijacking
They can.
our rational decision-making.
For sure.
It really highlights how important it is to be aware of our emotional state,
Yeah.
especially when making financial decisions.
Couldn't agree more.
Because it's not just about the numbers.
Yeah.
It's about how we're feeling.
It's about recognizing
Yeah.
that our feelings can have a powerful influence on our choices
Yeah.
and that we need to develop strategies to mitigate that influence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So much to think about already.
It's a lot.
And we're just getting
Right,
started.
just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we've got these two parts of our brains duking it out. Our rational mind's like, hey, let's make a good decision.
Mhm.
And then our emotions are like, oh, but what about this?
It's a constant tug of war. It is. Especially when it comes to our finances.
Oh, for sure.
So where does this overconfidence come from?
Right.
Is it just cognitive errors?
Okay.
Like, are we just making mistakes in our thinking?
Uh-huh.
Or is it driven by this desire to feel good about ourselves?
Okay.
Or maybe it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Right.
And luckily, there's research on this.
Okay.
There's a paper by Logmore and Tenney,
Mhm.
and they really dove deep into this question.
Okay.
What they found suggests that motivation does play a role,
Okay.
especially when dealing with vague or subjective traits.
Okay. So it's not just that we're fooling ourselves to feel good.
Right.
It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. It's not that simple.
Okay.
So cognitive factors also matter,
Okay.
like the complexity of the task
Hmm.
or how the information's presented to us.
So how do those cognitive factors play into this whole overconfidence thing?
So one key finding is that we tend to be more overconfident
Okay.
when we're dealing with vague concepts.
For example, if you ask someone how creative they are,
Right.
they're more likely to rate themselves highly
Mm-hmm.
than if you ask them to assess their performance on a specific creative task.
Oh, okay. So like
Yeah.
designing a logo or writing a poem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because creativity is subjective, right?
Yeah, it's very subjective.
Yeah, and people can define it in a way that makes them look good.
It's easier to maintain that inflated sense of self
It is.
when the criteria are kind of ambiguous.
Totally. But when we're faced with a concrete task,
Yeah.
it becomes harder to ignore our actual abilities.
It's like you're forced to be more honest
You are.
with yourself.
Yeah.
So specificity is key.
It is.
The more clearly defined something is,
Mhm.
the less room there is for that self-serving bias.
Right. Like trying to hit a target.
Oh,
If the target is huge and blurry,
yeah.
you're more likely to think you hit it,
Even if you didn't.
even if your aim was off.
But if it's smaller and more clearly defined,
Yeah.
you have to be more accurate.
In your assessment.
That's a great analogy.
So to really test this idea,
Right.
Logmore and Tenney, they did this really fascinating experiment
Okay.
using math and logic puzzles.
Interesting.
So they wanted to see how motivation and difficulty impacted people's self-assessments.
Clever.
So how did they set it up?
So they presented participants with a series of puzzles,
Okay.
kind of like what you might find on an IQ test.
Okay.
But they manipulated the participants' motivation
Okay.
by changing how they describe the task.
So some participants thought
Yeah.
that their performance on these puzzles was a true reflection of their intelligence.
Exactly.
And others were given like a less motivating description.
Right. They wanted to see if believing that the task was a measure of intelligence
Right.
would lead to overconfidence.
It's a real-life test of how much we want to feel smart.
Totally.
Right.
And they also varied the difficulty of the puzzles.
Okay, so they had motivation,
Uh-huh.
they had difficulty,
Yeah.
and they were measuring
Right.
overconfidence. What did they find?
Okay, so first they found that motivation didn't actually affect people's performance on the puzzles.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, people solved roughly the same number of puzzles correctly.
So even if you're super motivated,
Yeah.
doesn't make you better at solving puzzles?
Doesn't magically make you smarter.
Oh.
Our beliefs about ourselves don't always align with reality.
Right.
But when it came to self-assessments,
Okay.
motivation did have a subtle effect.
So I'm guessing the people who thought it was a test of their intelligence,
Yes.
they were more likely to say they did better.
They were more likely to say they were better than average.
Okay.
But when asked to predict their actual score and ranking,
Okay.
which is more concrete,
Right.
motivation had no impact.
So when it came down to it,
Yeah.
they had to be realistic.
They had to face reality.
Yeah.
And here's another interesting finding.
Okay.
Regardless of motivation,
Yeah.
participants tended to underestimate their performance.
Wait a minute.
Oh, yeah.
I thought we were talking about overconfidence.
I know, it's a twist.
Now we're talking about underconfidence.
So it seems that when faced with a clearly defined objective task,
Okay.
that tendency to inflate our abilities can actually diminish
Wow.
or even reverse.
So the reality check humbled them a bit.
Eh,
So it sounds like overconfidence might be more common
right.
in those situations where it's fuzzy
Yeah,
or subjective.
exactly.
Like those better than average assessments.
Yes.
It all comes back to specificity.
It does.
When things are clearly defined,
Hmm.
we're more honest with ourselves.
You have to be.
This is super important when
Yeah.
it comes to financial decisions
For sure.
because the stakes are high.
Absolutely.
Like,
We need to be grounded in reality,
yes.
not some inflated perception of ourselves.
You know this whole thing about honesty and self-assessment?
Yeah.
It makes me think, how do we even measure something like honesty?
Right.
Does it feel so subjective? Everyone has their own definition.
Yeah, good point.
So how do we actually assess it?
Well, Logmore and Tenney,
Okay.
they designed an experiment to explore how people define and assess their own honesty.
Okay. What do?
They asked participants to rate their own honesty and the honesty of others
Okay.
in 3 different ways.
Okay.
First, they used a general assessment.
Yeah, like how honest are you
Exactly.
on a scale of 1 to 9?
Yep. Classic better than average setup.
Yeah, where we can inflate ourselves.
For sure.
Easily.
Then they introduced a list of specific behaviors,
Okay.
like keeping promises,
Uh-huh.
not lying,
Okay.
returning lost items.
So more concrete,
More common.
measurable
Yes.
behavioral measures.
Right. And finally, they asked participants to rate the relevance of each behavior to their own definition of honesty.
So they could create their own honesty scorecard.
Basically.
Did it lead to more accurate self-assessment?
Well, the results were a bit surprising. As expected, participants initially rated themselves as more honest.
Than others?
Yeah, on that general assessment.
Classic better than average bias.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when asked to assess their honesty based on specific behaviors,
Okay.
that bias decreased.
It's like they were forced to be a bit more realistic.
Right. But here's the interesting part.
Okay.
When participants were allowed to weigh the behaviors based on their own definitions of honesty,
Low.
the better than average bias reemerged.
It came back.
And it was even stronger than before.
So giving them more control
I know, right?
made them more biased.
It seems that people assigned higher relevance to the behaviors they excelled at,
Whoa.
while downplaying the importance of the behaviors they struggled with.
We're all master manipulators of our own self-image.
Apparently.
It's like we find ways to justify our actions and beliefs,
We do.
even when there's evidence to the contrary.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
And this tendency to manipulate our own narratives can really affect our financial decisions.
It can.
We might tell ourselves we're good with money,
Right.
so a risky investment is actually safe.
Yeah.
Or we might convince ourselves that we don't need to save as much.
Because we're smart investors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like we're choosing the evidence
We are.
that supports our desired self-image.
You hit the nail on the head.
It's a powerful reminder that what we believe about ourselves
Yeah.
isn't always grounded in reality.
For sure.
And those beliefs can lead us down some dangerous financial paths.
Absolutely. So how do we combat this?
That is the question.
Right. If overconfidence can be so detrimental,
Mm.
what can we do to mitigate its effects
Yeah.
and make more objective financial decisions?
We've seen how easy it is to fall into these traps.
It is.
But surely there are ways to become more aware
There are
and make sounder choices.
For sure. Yeah, there are definitely things we can do.
So let's dive into those strategies.
Okay.
What's the first step towards becoming more rational
Mm-hmm.
and grounded in our financial decisions?
Well, I think the foundation really is awareness.
All
We need to acknowledge that we're all susceptible to these biases
Right.
and that overconfidence, especially in the financial realm, is just a human thing,
So step one, admit we have a problem.
basically.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So we've admitted we're not perfect.
Right.
What's next?
So the next step is to seek out objective information and diverse perspectives.
Okay.
So don't just rely on your gut feelings or intuition,
Especially with big decisions.
especially with big financial decisions.
Yeah.
Consult with financial advisors,
Hmm?
read reputable sources.
Do your research.
Exactly. Gather as much data as possible.
Be a critical consumer of information.
Absolutely. And when you're evaluating your options,
Yeah.
try to focus on concrete, measurable outcomes
Okay.
rather than vague or subjective assessments.
Instead of saying, I'm a great stock picker,
Right.
look at your actual track record.
Exactly. The numbers don't lie.
Ground your decisions in data.
Yes. Data, not wishful thinking.
I like that. And when setting financial goals, make sure they're specific,
Yes.
measurable, attainable, relevant,
All of that.
and time-bound.
The SMART goals.
It's SMART goals.
Classic for a reason.
It's like having a roadmap
Exactly.
instead of just wandering around.
Yes. Don't just wander aimlessly.
And don't be afraid to seek feedback.
That's a great...
Challenge your own assumptions.
Yes. Talk to people you trust.
Yeah.
Get a second opinion on your investment strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Be open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
That takes courage.
It does.
But sometimes the best advice comes from someone else,
Absolutely.
someone outside of our own little bubble.
Yeah, step outside your echo chamber.
Exactly.
And by embracing that growth mindset,
yeah.
we become more informed.
More objective.
More objective.
And ultimately more successful.
Yes. Take control of your financial destiny.
It's about making those smart, informed choices
Exactly.
that help us reach our goals.
Yes.
And build a more secure future.
It's all connected.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've definitely given our listeners a lot to think about today.
I hope so.
And hopefully some tools to navigate this whole world of finance.
Yeah. It's been a fascinating deep dive
Yeah.
into the human mind and how we think about money.
All those quirks
All the quirks.
that we have.
Yeah.
So on that note, we've reached the end of our exploration of financial overconfidence.
We have.
Be sure to check out the show notes
Yes.
for links to all the research that we discussed.
All the fascinating studies.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay informed.
And stay grounded in reality.
And remember,
Yeah,
a little bit of self-doubt can go a long way
that's a good one.
in protecting your financial well-being.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
See you next time.